We've all stood in the kitchen, the refrigerator light a cold, indifferent spotlight on our inadequacies. It's that moment when the silence of the house becomes a physical weight, pressing down on your shoulders as you mentally tally the contents of your pantry. A half-empty bag of rice, a jar of pickles that's been there since the last president, and the lingering, metallic taste of desperation. We're taught that struggle is a private affair, a shameful secret to be locked away behind a smile and a forced, "we're fine." But the universe, in its strange, indifferent way, has a dark sense of humor. It knows when you're at your absolute lowest, when the last shred of your dignity is hanging by a thread. And sometimes, in that moment of profound isolation, it sends a reminder that you are not nearly as invisible as you think. It comes in the form of a stranger, a shadow on your doorstep, who holds a truth you've been trying to hide from the world, and from yourself. This is a story about that moment. A story about the terrifying intimacy of poverty, the unexpected grace of a stranger, and the most terrifying word a parent can utter to a hungry child: tomorrow. The sound of an empty refrigerator is not silence. It's a hum, a low, mechanical thrum that seems to mock you with its relentless, purposeless energy. It's the sound of a machine working hard to keep nothing cold, a perfect metaphor for the state of your life. I stood there, my hand resting on the chrome handle of the freezer door, the metal cool and unyielding against my palm. I didn't need to open it. I knew what was inside. A bag of frozen peas, frostbitten and ancient, and a single, lonesome chicken leg that had been there so long it was developing its own ecosystem. I held my breath, listening to the house. The floorboards above me groaned under the weight of my two children, Sam and Ellie, their muffled giggles a stark, painful contrast to the hollow feeling in my gut. They were playing, oblivious to the arithmetic I was doing in my head. For the last 3 months it had been like this, a slow, steady erosion. I was a carpenter once. My hands had built porches and framed houses, my work a tangible testament to my labor, but construction was the first to go when the economy dipped. A burst of work here, a small job there, but never enough to fill the hole. My wife, Sarah, worked part-time at the local library, her salary a trickle against a dam of bills. We cut everything. The cable, the internet, the gym memberships. We sold my truck, my beautiful, beat-up Ford, and bought a clunker of a sedan that coughed its way to the grocery store and back. The last luxury to go was the illusion of security. I closed the refrigerator door, the light winking out as it clicked shut. The hum seemed to grow louder in the sudden darkness of the kitchen. The only other light came from the living room, casting a weak, yellow glow onto the linoleum floor. Sarah was in there, sitting in the armchair we'd found at a garage sale for $20, a library book open on her lap. She wasn't reading it. Her eyes were fixed on a spot on the wall, a small crack in the plaster that looked like a crooked lightning bolt. She'd been staring at it a lot lately. I watched her for a moment, the way she unconsciously rubbed her thumb against her forefinger, a nervous habit she'd developed. The weight of our situation was etched into the fine lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders were perpetually hunched forward, as if she were bracing for a blow she couldn't see coming. She was a fighter, my Sarah, but even fighters get tired. She was trying to be strong for the kids, I knew that. But I could see the cracks, the subtle ways her resilience was fraying at the edges. The way she'd flinch at the sound of the mailman, the way she'd pretend not to notice the phone ringing, knowing it was another bill collector. The kids, bless them, were mostly oblivious. Sam was 8, with a wild imagination and an unshakable belief that his dad could fix anything. He had my hands, long and slender, and his mother's stubborn, questioning eyes. He'd been asking for a new pair of sneakers for weeks. His old ones had a hole in the toe, and his socks were perpetually damp from the dew on the grass. I'd promised him a pair soon. It was a hollow promise, a penny in a wishing well that had long since dried up. Ellie was 5, a sweet, ethereal child who lived in a world of princesses and fairy tales. Her world was simpler, more forgiving than ours. She didn't understand why we couldn't have pizza for dinner anymore. She just knew that her daddy was sad, and that made her sad too. I walked into the living room, my footsteps heavy on the creaking floorboards. "Hey," I said, my voice a little too bright. "How was school?" Sam looked up from the drawing he was making on a napkin with a stubby crayon. Good. We learned about dinosaurs. Did you know a T-Rex had arms like this? He held out his own tiny arms, wiggling his fingers. I felt a pang in my chest. I'd been a T-Rex once too. I'd had the world in my grip, a steady job, a growing family. Now I felt like my own arms were useless, pinned to my side by an invisible force of circumstance. Wow, that's really small, I said, forcing a smile. Did you get the job, Daddy? It was Ellie. She looked up from her coloring book, her big, blue eyes, so like her mother, fixed on me with an earnestness that was more painful than any judgment. I opened my mouth to speak, to lie, to say anything that would make her face light up, but the words died in my throat. I looked at Sarah. Her eyes were pleading with me, begging me not to dash their hope, but I couldn't lie to them anymore. It was a poison, feeding them false promises. Not yet, sweetie, I said, my voice a low rasp. But I'm trying. Sarah's face tightened. It was the wrong answer. She wanted to protect them, to shield them from this dark, ugly truth. But the truth was all we had left. It was the only real thing in a house that felt like it was built on a foundation of sand. The kids returned to their activities, their disappointment fleeting, a small cloud passing over a sunny day. They didn't understand the gravity of it. To them, not yet simply meant soon. To me, it was an ocean I was drowning in. That evening, I decided to make a fancy dinner. It was a pathetic attempt at normalcy. I opened the cupboard and surveyed the meager offerings. A half box of elbow macaroni, a can of crushed tomatoes, and a shriveled onion that was starting to sprout. It was a meal for a famine. The pot of water bubbled on the stove, a small, pathetic geyser of hope. I noticed the silence first, the absence of humming. The refrigerator had finally given up the ghost. It was a quiet surrender. I opened the door and a wave of stale, warm air washed over me. The food, the frozen peas, the ancient chicken leg, was slowly turning into a science project. I felt a cold dread creep into my bones. It wasn't just a loss of cold, it was a loss of control. The last bastion of our food storage was gone. Sarah came into the kitchen. She saw my face, saw the defeated slump of my shoulders. "What is it?" she whispered. "The fridge is dead," I said, my voice flat. The news hit her like a physical blow. The hope in her eyes, a tiny, flickering flame that had been burning by sheer willpower, finally sputtered and died. She didn't say anything. She just nodded, her lips pressed into a thin, white line. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. It wasn't a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between two people who know each other well. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, filled with the unspoken words of our failure. It was the silence of a fallen god, the sound of a man who could no longer provide. I drained the macaroni, the steam rising in a desperate plume. I was trying to save face, to manufacture an illusion of a meal. As I poured the crushed tomatoes over the limp pasta, I felt a desperate, reckless urge. I remembered the last of the emergency money, $50 hidden in the bottom of my sock drawer. It was our last line of defense, our only hope for gas money or a new appliance. I had been guarding it with my life. But in that moment, a wicked thought crept in. What if I used it? What if I just went to the store and bought a real dinner? A couple of steaks, a box of ice cream, a bottle of wine. Something that would make my wife smile, something that would make my kids feel like things were going to be okay. The thought was tempting. It was the siren song of a false prophet promising a brief moment of happiness, but I knew what would happen tomorrow. We wouldn't have money for gas, and my job search would be over. The bill collectors wouldn't care about our little feast. The piper would still come to collect. I was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, looking at the tempting green pastures below. One step and I could fly. But I also knew the fall would be fatal. I dumped the pasta into a chipped bowl and called the kids to the table. "Dinner's ready," I announced, the words a hollow echo in the silent house. There was no excited scramble, no clatter of chairs. They simply shuffled in, their eyes falling on the meager offering. It was a mountain of plain, red-tinted macaroni. There were no smiles. Sam poked at his food with his fork. "Is this all there is?" he asked, his voice small. "Eat your dinner, Sam," Sarah said, her voice sharper than she intended. Ellie looked at her plate, her lower lip trembling. "I'm not hungry," she whispered. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. My children were eating a meal that was nothing more than a desperate act of survival. I looked at my wife, her eyes glistening in the dim light. She was doing her best to hold it together, but I could see the storm brewing behind her eyes. I pushed my bowl away. The pasta sat there, a monument to my inadequacy. I looked at my family, these 3 beautiful souls who depended on me, and I felt a wave of self-loathing so profound it made my stomach churn. I had failed. I was a failure. I had let the world beat me. I was a man who couldn't even feed his own children. "There's a bit of bread," Sarah said, her voice strained, trying to find a silver lining in this grim reality. "Left over from the other day." We ate the bread in silence. It was dry and tasted like cardboard. It was the last of our resources. I felt a knot of despair in my stomach as I realized we were facing the night without a single morsel for tomorrow. The thought of waking up to empty cupboards, of seeing my children's faces drop when they asked for breakfast, was a form of torture. Later that night, after the kids were in bed, the house felt like a tomb. I sat on the porch looking up at the stars, a cold cup of tap water in my hand. The night was clear and cold, the stars like a million diamonds scattered across a black velvet cloth. It was a beautiful, indifferent sky, a silent witness to my suffering. I had gone from a man who built things with his hands, a man with a purpose, to a man who felt like a ghost. I was haunting my own life. I was a ghost in the machine. I heard Sarah come out. She was wearing my old flannel shirt, the one she always stole when she was cold. She wrapped her arms around my shoulders, her head resting on my back. It was a gesture of comfort, of solidarity. I reached back and placed my hand on hers. It was a moment of fragile connection in a sea of despair. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words feeling woefully inadequate. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be," she said, her voice muffled against my back. "We'll figure it out, we always do." But even as she said it, I could hear the doubt in her voice. We had survived the summer, but winter was coming, and winter was cruel. The wind picked up, whistling through the pines. It was a lonely, haunting sound, the sound of a world that had forgotten us. I looked out at the road, a long, dark ribbon stretching into the night. There was no one coming, no help on the horizon. It was just us, our failing hope, and the looming specter of a hungry morning. Sleep was a shallow, restless thing, a haunted coastland of half-formed anxieties. I woke before dawn, the sky outside our window a bruised, purplish hue. The house was still, save for the occasional groan of the wood settling, a sound that now felt accusatory, as if the very structure was lamenting its own neglect. My eyes stung from a sleepless night, and my stomach was a tight, empty knot. I lay there for a long while, listening to Sarah's soft, steady breathing beside me. She was so beautiful, even in sleep. Her face was relaxed, free of the worry lines that had taken up residence there during the day. I felt a surge of love so intense it was painful. I would do anything for her, anything. But the anything was a vast, empty void, a promise I had no power to keep. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her. The floor was cold against my bare feet. I padded into the kitchen, my steps silent, a ghost in my own home. I looked at the cupboard, a fortress I was supposed to defend. I opened it. The silence was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket. I closed it again, unable to face the stark reality of its emptiness. It was like opening a family tomb. The kids would be up soon. The thought was a punch to the gut. What was I going to tell them? The sun was just starting to crest over the horizon, casting long, orange fingers of light across the kitchen floor. It was a beautiful sunrise, a mockery of a beautiful sunrise. Sarah found me there, standing in the middle of the kitchen, frozen, as if the linoleum had turned to quicksand and was slowly pulling me under. She was pale, her dark hair a messy halo around her face. She looked at me, her eyes a reflection of my own fear. "Good morning," she whispered, the words a fragile hope in the stillness. I couldn't answer, I just shook my head. She walked over to me, her movements slow and deliberate, and she took my hand. Her fingers were cold. "Don't you worry about the kids," she said, her voice a low, determined murmur. "I'll tell them we're going to have a big breakfast later, a surprise breakfast." The plan was a lie, a beautiful, well-intentioned lie. But it was all we had. It was a thread of dignity in a world of unraveling fabric. "We can't keep this up, Sarah," I said, the words tasting like ash. "They need to eat today." "I know," she said. "I know. Let me go down to the pantry. I think there's some old pancake mix. It's probably a year expired, but it might be okay. We could make some for the kids just to get them through the morning. Then you and I will figure out the rest." She was trying to salvage something, anything. She was building a dam out of toothpicks, but she was trying, and I loved her for it. I watched her rummage through the pantry, a small, poorly lit closet that was our last hope. The kids woke up full of chatter, their voices a bright, jarring contrast to the silence of the kitchen. They came bounding down the stairs, their feet thumping on the wooden steps. "Is it pancake day?" Sam shouted, his voice full of the unfiltered, hopeful joy that only a child could possess. I forced a smile. "It's a special breakfast day," I said, the lie a bitter pill on my tongue. "Your mom's making something special." Sarah appeared in the doorway, a small, apologetic smile on her face. "Well," she said, holding up a box of pancake mix that looked like it was from another era, "I found it. It might be a little crunchy, but it'll do." I watched as she poured the mix into a bowl, adding water and stirring it into a thin, grayish batter. She poured it onto a hot griddle I had managed to salvage from the camping gear. The batter sizzled, and a small, fragrant plume of steam rose into the air. It smelled like hope. A false hope, but a welcome one. We all gathered around the table, the kids eager and smiling. It was a small moment of normalcy, a tiny victory in a string of defeats. But the moment of peace didn't last. A strange, uncomfortable feeling settled over me, a prickle at the back of my neck. I looked out the window. The world outside was quiet, the road empty and still, but something was different. There was a presence, a feeling of being watched. It was absurd, I knew. We lived in the middle of nowhere. Our nearest neighbor was a mile down the road, but the feeling was persistent, a low hum of unease that vibrated in my bones. I put my fork down. "I'm just going to check the mailbox," I said, the excuse flimsy. "The mailman wouldn't be here for hours." Sarah looked at me, a flicker of concern in her eyes. She knew I was lying. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't press. She just nodded, her hand tightening on her coffee cup. I walked outside, the morning air cold and crisp against my face. The sun was now fully up, painting the landscape in brilliant shades of gold and orange. The world was beautiful and I was miserable. I walked towards the end of the driveway, my eyes scanning the horizon. The feeling of being watched intensified. I looked at the trees that lined our property. The pine needles were still, the branches heavy with dew. Nothing moved, just silence. And the feeling, a heavy, impossible weight. I was about to turn around and go back inside, to retreat into the familiar cocoon of my failure, when I saw it. A silhouette. It was standing at the edge of the property near an old oak tree. It was a man. He was wearing a dark coat, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He was just standing there, still as a statue, his hands at his sides. My heart lurched. A wave of primal fear washed over me. Was he a bill collector, a repo man, a stranger with ill intent? My mind raced, flashing through a series of terrifying scenarios. I was a man with nothing. And I was afraid of losing what little I had left, my family's safety. I took a tentative step forward. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, an immovable, silent sentinel. The fear turned to a cold, hard knot in my stomach. I saw a flash of a movement from behind the tree. Another man. My heart stopped. There were two of them. They started walking towards me. Their movements were slow, deliberate, not threatening exactly, but purposeful. I stood my ground, my fists clenched at my sides. I had never been in a fight in my life, but I would fight for my family. I would fight with my bare hands if I had to. As they drew nearer, I could see them more clearly. They were older, weathered men, their faces lined with years of hard work. They were dressed in simple, practical clothes, their boots scuffed and dusty. They looked like migrant workers or day laborers. One of them, the one who had been standing under the oak, had a long black braid that hung down his back. His skin was the color of rich, dark earth, and his eyes were a deep, bottomless brown. He had a powerful, quiet dignity about him that was unnerving. He looked at me, and I felt as though he could see right through me, past my flimsy defenses, to the frightened, empty man beneath. The other man, shorter and stockier, had a weathered face like a cracked riverbed. He carried a small, cloth bag in his hands. He didn't look at me with the same piercing intensity. He looked at the ground as if he were uncomfortable. The tall man stopped a few feet from me. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, his gaze unwavering. I swallowed hard. "Who are you? What do you want?" I asked, my voice steady despite the trembling in my chest. The tall man spoke. His voice was a low, resonant rumble like distant thunder. "I am here with a message," he said, "from the spirits." The words hung in the air, strange and out of place. I blinked, momentarily confused. Spirits. This was not a conversation I was prepared for. I had been expecting a demand for money, a threat of eviction, a desperate plea for work. I hadn't expected a pronouncement from the dead. "Spirits," I repeated, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. He nodded slowly. "They have been watching, they see your struggle, they see the weight on your heart." He gestured to his companion. "My friend here, he saw you last night. He saw the light on in your kitchen. He saw you at the table, your children, the tears on your wife's face. And the spirits came to him. They whispered his name. They told him to come here." I was stunned. The world felt like it had tilted on its axis. These men, these mysterious, stoic figures, were telling me that they had witnessed our private humiliation. My first instinct was anger, a burning, defensive anger. How dare they? How dare they watch us from the shadows? How dare they speak of my family's suffering as if it were a spectacle? "What do you want?" I asked again, my voice harsher this time. The tall man seemed unfazed by my anger. He simply looked at me with those calm, deep eyes. "We want to give you something," he said. He nodded to his companion. The shorter man stepped forward and held out the cloth bag. It was a simple, unassuming bag tied with a piece of rawhide. "This is for you," he mumbled, his voice soft, barely audible. I looked at the bag, then back at the tall man. "I don't need charity," I said, the words a reflex, a desperate attempt to reclaim some of my fractured pride. "This is not charity," the tall man said. "This is a gift from the earth. The spirits are generous, but they are not foolish. They know you are a man of honor. They know you have pride. They are not asking you to beg. They are simply offering a hand." The words were like a balm on a raw wound. It wasn't charity. It was a gift, an offering. The distinction was subtle, but it was everything. It allowed me to keep the shred of dignity I had left. I hesitated. My hand trembled as I reached out and took the bag. It was heavy. I could feel the weight of its contents through the rough cloth. The tall man stepped back, his companion following suit. "There is food in there," the tall man said, his voice softening. "It is not much, but it will fill your bellies for a while. There is also something else." "What?" I asked, my voice a hoarse whisper. "You will see," he said. "And when you are ready, if you wish, you can come to us. We live a day's walk to the north. You will know the way. We will be waiting." Before I could ask anything else, they turned and started walking back towards the tree line. They moved with a fluid, silent grace, their footsteps barely making a sound on the dead leaves. I watched them go, the bag heavy in my hands. I was speechless, frozen in a state of shock. I didn't understand what had just happened. I didn't know who they were or why they had come. I just knew that I was standing in the middle of my driveway, holding a bag of food and feeling a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through my chest. It was a tiny, fragile ember of hope, and it was all I had. I stood there for a long, breathless moment, the strange bag hanging from my hand. The air was still, the birds had gone silent. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for my next move. I looked towards the tree line, but the two men had vanished, swallowed by the forest as if they had been a dream. I glanced down at the bag. It was real. The rough hemp fibers were coarse against my palm, a tangible anchor in a world that suddenly felt as insubstantial as smoke. A feeling, hot and shameful, surged up from my gut. It was anger, a flash of fury so potent it made my vision blur. Who the hell were they to show up at my home to watch me in my moment of weakness? To look at me with those knowing, pitying eyes and offer me a gift like some kind of benevolent spirit from a bad fairy tale. My pride, the last decrepit structure I was clinging to in the ruins of my life, roared to life. I was a man, damn it. A husband, a father. I could take care of my own family. I didn't need a handout from a pair of forest ghosts. I wanted to throw the bag into the woods. I wanted to march after them and demand they take it back. I wanted to scream that I was not a beggar, that I was a man who had simply fallen on hard times. The words were on the tip of my tongue, a hot, volcanic eruption of defensive pride. But I didn't throw it. The bag was heavy and it held something that the cold, empty cupboard could not, a promise. A promise of food for my children. That simple, elemental truth was the only thing that mattered. My pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. For my children, I would swallow it whole, no matter how bitter it tasted. The sounds of the house drifted out to me. I heard Sam's high-pitched giggle followed by Ellie's more melodic one. They were at the window. I could see their two small faces pressed against the glass, their breath fogging the pane. They were watching me, their eyes wide with curiosity. They had seen the strangers. They had seen me take the bag. I couldn't hide this from them. I had to go inside and face them. I took a deep breath, the cold air searing my lungs, and walked back into the house. The warmth of the kitchen was a physical embrace, a stark contrast to the cold knot in my stomach. Sarah was standing by the table, her arms crossed, her eyes a mixture of fear and confusion. The kids were at the window, their noses still pressed to the glass. "Daddy, who were those men?" Sam asked, turning to me. "Were they Indians?" The question was so blunt, so perfectly innocent that it almost made me laugh. "It's Apache, Sam," I corrected him, my voice sounding strange and distant. "They were Apache." "What did they want?" Ellie asked, her voice small and serious. "Are they bad guys?" "No, honey," I said, the words feeling heavy. "No, they're not bad guys. They were just people. They brought us something." I walked to the table and set the bag down. It made a soft thump as it landed on the wood. Sarah came closer, her eyes fixed on it. The kids followed, their curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice a low whisper. "I don't know," I admitted. "They said it was a gift." I fumbled with the rawhide string, my fingers clumsy. I finally managed to untie it, my heart pounding in my chest. I pulled the fabric open and peered inside. My breath caught in my throat. It was filled with food, not just scraps or cast-offs, but real, honest-to-God food. There were bags of dried corn and beans, the staples of a simple, hearty meal. There were bundles of dried herbs that smelled of sage and juniper, a pungent, cleansing aroma. There were pieces of smoked meat, dark and leathery, a gift of protein that felt more precious than gold. And at the very bottom, wrapped in a soft piece of deerskin, was something else. I pulled it out. It was a small, hand-carved wooden bowl. It was a work of art, its surface smooth as silk, stained a deep, rich brown. It was simple, but it was beautiful. It was a piece of someone's soul, carved out of a tree that had grown for 100 years. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sight of the food, so abundant and unexpected, had rendered us all speechless. Then Sarah let out a soft sob, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, were fixed on the contents of the bag. It was as if a dam had broken inside her. The fear, the worry, the constant, grinding pressure of the past months all came rushing out in that single, choked sound. The kids, sensing their mother's emotion, started to move closer to her. Ellie wrapped her little arms around Sarah's legs, burying her face in her thigh. I stood there, the wooden bowl cradled in my hands, my own eyes burning. I couldn't speak. The weight of the gift was too great. It wasn't just the food. It was the act itself, the kindness, the anonymity. These men, these strangers from a world I knew nothing about, had seen us in our darkest moment and had chosen to offer a hand. They didn't ask for anything in return. They just gave. The silence in the kitchen was no longer the silence of despair. It was a sacred, hushed silence, filled with the unspoken gratitude of a family on the verge of breaking. I carefully placed the bowl on the table and pulled out the bags of corn and beans. We had dinner. We had a feast of simple, honest food brought to us by an act of grace. "Let's make a fire," I said, my voice rough with emotion. "Let's make a real meal together." The hours that followed were a blur of simple domestic activity. It was the most beautiful, soul-soothing blur of my life. I went outside and gathered wood, the scent of pine and earth filling my senses. I built a fire in the old stone hearth, the flames crackling and dancing, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. It was a fire of survival, but it was also a fire of rebirth. It was a fire that was pushing back the cold darkness of our despair. Sarah and the kids worked alongside me. Ellie helped her mother wash the beans in a large pot, her small hands scrubbing them with a concentration that was both sweet and heartbreaking. Sam, with a seriousness that belied his age, arranged the logs in the fireplace, trying to build a fire like he'd seen his father do 100 times. The kitchen was filled with the sounds of our labor, the bubbling of the pot, the crackling of the fire, the soft murmur of our voices. It was a symphony of hope. I added the dried meat to the beans, the aroma filling the small house with a scent that was more comforting than any perfume. The herbs, crushed and added to the pot, lent the stew a subtle, earthy flavor that I had never tasted before. When the stew was finally ready, we filled the beautiful wooden bowl with a generous portion. It was the centerpiece of our meal. We sat around the small, rickety table, our faces illuminated by the firelight. It was a scene that could have been from 100 years ago, a scene of frontier life, a scene of a family grateful for what they had. "This is good," Sam said, his cheeks stuffed with a piece of smoked meat. "Really, really good." "It's better than good," Sarah said, her eyes meeting mine across the table. Her smile was a genuine, radiant thing, a smile I hadn't seen in months. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about the past or the future. I wasn't thinking about the bills, the job interviews, the weight of my inadequacy. I was just present in that moment with my family. I was eating the best meal I had ever had, and I was sharing it with the people I loved most in the world. As we ate, the kids begged for a story. I was too tired to think of one, so I told them about the Apache. I told them about their history, their wisdom, their deep connection to the land. I told them about the strangers who had come to our door. They were not scary, I told them. They were men of honor. They were the ones who had saved us. After dinner, we cleared the dishes and put the leftovers away. The leftover food filled the empty shelves, a tangible promise of more meals to come. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It felt like the beginning of something. Later that night, I sat on the porch again, the wooden bowl in my lap. The fire had died down to a pile of glowing embers. I was looking up at the stars, the same stars I had stared at the night before. They seemed different now, brighter, more hopeful. I traced the smooth, polished rim of the bowl with my thumb. I thought about the Apache men. I thought about their words. "The spirits have been watching." I wasn't sure I believed in spirits. I wasn't sure I believed in much of anything anymore. But I did believe in people. I believed in the simple, profound power of human kindness. And that night, under the vast, indifferent sky, I believed in hope again. I had been given a gift, not just food, but a chance to see that my struggle was not unseen, a chance to remember that I was part of a larger world, a world that was capable of grace. I looked to the north, towards the woods. A day's walk, the man had said. A day's walk to a new beginning. The fire flickered, its last desperate gasps casting dancing shadows across the living room. The kids were asleep in their beds, dreaming of the feast we had shared. The house smelled of sage and wood smoke, a warm, comforting aroma that felt like a protective blanket. Sarah was curled up on the old sofa, her head in my lap, her breathing slow and even. I stroked her hair, the strands soft against my calloused fingers. The wooden bowl sat on the coffee table, a silent, elegant monument to the previous night's miracle. I couldn't sleep. My mind was a storm of thoughts, a chaotic whirlwind of hope, fear, and a strange, burgeoning curiosity. The gift had been a shock to the system, a jarring interruption to the relentless narrative of our failure. It had given us a moment of respite, a brief interlude of peace. But it couldn't solve the underlying problem. We were still broke. I was still unemployed. The specter of the empty cupboard was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for its return. But the gift had done something else, something more profound. It had shifted my perspective. I was no longer just a man drowning in a sea of his own inadequacy. I was a man who had been offered a rope, and that rope, I knew, was tied to the land to the north. The words of the Apache man echoed in my mind. When you are ready, if you wish, you can come to us. It was a strange proposition, an invitation to a world I knew nothing about, a world that seemed to exist in a different century, a world of the forest, the spirits, and a simple, sustainable way of life. It was terrifying. It was ridiculous. It was the most compelling thought I'd had in months. In the morning, I broached the subject with Sarah. The light was soft and gray, filtering through the kitchen window. I sat across from her, the remnants of our coffee, made from a small bag of grounds they'd also included in the gift, steaming between us. I think I should go to them, I said, my voice low. She looked up, her eyes searching mine. To the Apache, she asked, her tone careful. Why? The man said I could come if I wanted, I replied, picking at a splinter in the table. He said they'd be waiting. I think they might have work, or maybe some kind of, I don't know, a different life. She was silent for a long time. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the hope that this might be a solution warring with the deep-seated fear of the unknown. She was a creature of order and predictability. The world of the Apache, a world of ancient traditions and an itinerant existence, was a world of chaos. It was the opposite of everything she had ever wanted. What about us? She finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. What about the kids? I'll be back, I said, leaning across the table and taking her hand. I promise. I just need to see. I need to understand. Maybe they can teach me something. Maybe there's a way to make a living there. A way that doesn't involve a boss or a paycheck or the constant fear of being laid off. She shook her head slowly, her jaw tight. I don't know, John. I don't know if I can handle you being gone. Not now. Not after everything. I'll only be gone for a few days, I insisted, squeezing her hand. Just until I get my bearings. You have enough food to last you at least a week. I'll bring back help, or I'll come back with news. Either way, it'll be better than us just sitting here, waiting for the next disaster. She looked at me, her eyes holding a galaxy of unspoken fears. I could see the vulnerability, the anxiety, the desperate need to hold on to the small semblance of security we had scraped together. But I could also see a flicker of something else. A reckless, desperate hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, her husband could find a way to pull them out of the abyss. Just come back, she whispered. Promise me you'll come back. I promise, I said, the words a solemn vow. The morning sun painted the house in a soft, golden light as I gathered my meager supplies. I packed a canteen of water, a few pieces of the smoked meat, and a small knife. I wore my sturdiest boots, the leather worn and cracked, and a thick woolen jacket that had seen better days. I kissed Sarah goodbye on the porch, a long, lingering kiss that tasted of salt and desperation. Be careful, she said, her voice trembling. I will. I kissed the kids, still groggy from sleep, their small faces full of a wide-eyed wonder. Is Daddy going on an adventure? Sam asked. Something like that, I said. I'll be back before you know it. And then I left. I walked north towards the tree line. The familiar world of my home, the old farmhouse, the rusted sedan, the overgrown yard, gradually faded from view, swallowed by the dense, watchful presence of the woods. The journey was a baptism of fire. The forest was not the gentle, romanticized place of storybooks. It was a wild, untamed place, teeming with life and danger. The path was barely discernible, a winding trail that led through towering pines and over moss-covered rocks. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The sounds were alien to me. The caw of unseen birds, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, the creak of ancient trees. I felt a profound sense of vulnerability. I was a man who had spent his life in the controlled environment of a construction site, surrounded by the tools of his trade. Out here, in the embrace of the wild, I was a novice. I was a stranger in a foreign land. Every snapping twig, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I walked for hours, the sun climbing to its zenith and then slowly descending towards the west. My legs ached, my feet were blistered, and a deep thirst had taken root in my throat. I was exhausted, my body screaming for rest, but I pushed on. I thought of Sarah's face, of Ellie's trusting eyes, of Sam's boundless energy. I was doing this for them. I couldn't quit. As dusk began to settle, a deep, primal fear took hold of me. The forest had grown darker, the shadows lengthening into menacing shapes. I had no shelter, no plan. A wave of despair washed over me. What the hell was I doing? I was a fool. A desperate, hopeless fool. But then I saw it. A faint glimmer of light flickering through the trees. My heart leaped into my throat. It was a fire. I pushed forward, stumbling over roots and rocks, my pace quickening with each step. I emerged into a small clearing, and there in the center of it was an encampment. There were 3 wickiups, cone-shaped structures made of wooden poles and covered with animal hides. A central fire blazed in the middle of the clearing, casting a warm, welcoming glow. And sitting around the fire were the 2 men from the driveway. They were not alone. There were others, 5 in total, women and children, an entire family. The tall man, the one who had spoken to me, was the first to see me. He stood up and walked towards me, his movements fluid and graceful. "You came," he said. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact. "I came," I replied, my voice hoarse with exhaustion. He nodded, his face unreadable. "You are tired, you are hungry, come, sit, we have much to discuss." I followed him to the fire, my legs trembling with fatigue. I collapsed onto a log, the warmth of the flames washing over me. The others looked at me with curious, unblinking eyes. There was no hostility, but there was also no warmth. It was the gaze of people who were observing something new, something alien. A woman, her face weathered and lined, handed me a bowl of stew. It was the same stew we had made, the flavor of sage and earth rich on my tongue. I ate it in silence, my hunger a desperate, ravenous thing. The tall man introduced himself as Gray Wolf. His companion was called Laughing Crow. There was also a young man called White Fox, and a woman, the one who had given me the stew, named Morning Star. The rest were children, their eyes wide and curious. They spoke a broken, halting English, their sentences peppered with words from their native tongue. But they were patient with me, explaining the way of their life. They were a small family, a remnant of a tribe that had been decimated by disease and war. They lived by hunting, fishing, and gathering. They moved with the seasons, following the deer and the elk. They had no money, no bills, no bosses. They simply survived, their existence a cycle of giving and taking from the land. Gray Wolf explained that the gift they had given me was not out of pity. It was an act of reciprocity. They had seen my family's suffering and they had felt a kinship with us. They, too, had known hardship. They, too, had been on the verge of starvation. They had also received help from a stranger, a long time ago. They were simply paying forward the kindness they had once received. As the night deepened, the conversation turned to my future. Gray Wolf told me that they could use another hunter, another strong back. He could teach me the ways of the forest, the art of tracking, the skills of survival. It would be a hard life, a life of constant work and few luxuries, but it was a life of freedom. You have a choice, he said, his voice a low rumble. You can go back to your world, the world of the empty cupboard and the broken promise. Or you can stay here, learn from us, and build a new life for your family. The choice is yours. I looked around the fire. The stars were out, a million brilliant lights scattered across the black velvet sky. The smell of smoke and pine filled the air. It was a place of immense, raw beauty, a world so different from the one I had known that it felt like a dream. And in that moment I knew my answer. I wasn't a carpenter anymore. I was a hunter, a provider, a man who could feed his family with his own two hands. I looked at Gray Wolf, at the strength and wisdom in his eyes. I choose to stay, I said. My family will come. I will build a home for them here. We will survive. Gray Wolf nodded slowly, a faint smile touching his lips. You will survive, he echoed. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the night sky. I looked to the south, in the direction of my old life. A week ago I had been a ghost in my own home. Now I was a man with a purpose. I was a man ready to build a new world.